Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes, and here are 7 big stories for today. I tried to limit it, but you need to hear these 7 stories. So we'll start here at this ammunition warehouse we talked about this morning in Toropets, Tver region. Okay, somebody corrected me. It's not Tiver, it's Tver region in Russia has been turned into a volcanic region. It's still exploding. Absolutely spectacular view possible, the biggest single event of that kind in the war. It's probably second only to the sinking of the Moskva as far as the amount of a black eye that it just gave Putin. Now, I talked about that this morning, so I'm not going to go over everything with it, but I talked about it in this video here, but you can see it from space. This is Radio Free Europe. A new satellite image obtained by Radio Svoboda showed that the fire at the ammunition depot in Toropets, which was struck by Ukrainian UAVs. 100 UAVs involved in this action. One of my viewers, Greg something or another, or Greg, I can't remember what his name was, said, you know, they ought to name Ukrainian UAVs debris. Just call them debris so they can say they shot down debris. Yeah, because they always say it was just falling debris that has hit this place. Yeah. Okay, big story number 2. Russia continues to use social media to interfere in elections and destabilize. Now, we know that that's the case, but here from the ISW in Euromaidan Press, the ISW assessed that Russia is continuing its efforts to develop capabilities to use information operations on social media platforms to trigger kinetic activity and conduct election interference, destabilization measures, and sanctions evasion schemes. Okay, United 24 Media, a recent leak of internal documents from Russian Agency for Social Design, ASD, obtained by European outlets, reveals Russia's main strategies in spreading disinformation to undermine Ukraine, its leadership, and Western allies. Leaked documents expose ASD's disinformation strategy of circulating fake official documents to push Russian narratives. Like what? Well, I'm glad you asked. One example is a forged order by Ukraine's commander-in-chief equating surrender with treason to undermine Ukraine's leadership and military morale. Well, I understand why that would be frustrating. Remember this guy, the picture of Zelensky, that, you know, he's upset because he hasn't asked for $1 billion lately, that sort of thing. Okay, so there are other ones here. A fake video styled to look like Ukrainian refugees accidentally set a German family's home on fire while burning a Russian flag. Well, the fact checkers went and debunked it. So there's lots of this stuff floating around. The most recent one that I've seen is false claim that Vice President Harris was involved in a June 2011 hit and run incident that left a 13-year-old girl paralyzed. It was created by a Russian troll farm, according to a report released by Microsoft. So if you see that, you can safely discount it. And, you know, you need to be aware of that. And we don't want that to happen in our elections. I don't want this any more than we should want, well, this. This is not Russian propaganda or Russian fakes, but this was a fake. Somebody just made it up, put it on Twitter, and cited a page number where this isn't an actual story, but still, there are all kinds of couch memes, and people still believe that this is what was going on. Okay, so we don't want to have any of that involved in our elections. Russia is changing its propaganda narratives about the war. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the main narratives of the Russian Federation have been NATO attacked peaceful Russia and started the war through the hands of Ukrainians. Russia has to defend itself. Ukraine is part of Russia, or the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. Ukraine is not an independent state and was invented. It's not its own entity. Russia always wants negotiations and peace, but the puppet Ukraine, under the influence of the aggressive West, does not want peace. Or Russia does not commit any war crimes or strike civilian cities. All of this is fabricated. They're all fakes. But in recent weeks, certain changes to this narrative have been very clear. Russians have started promoting messages like that Ukraine is supporting T. I say T, you can read what T is here, right? I don't want to say it for YouTube censors, and ISIS. The Russian Foreign Ministry has distributed a large report claiming that it has documented over 100 T operations carried out by Ukraine. This is an absolutely cynical lie. Russia started these attempts earlier, for example, by finding Ukraine traced to the Crocus attack, and then they're looking for other ways to connect it to it, whether it's true or not, and it's not. They're trying to do that. It's necessary to counter Russian disinformation. Absolutely. I agree. I know I'm a proponent of more free speech, but you have to counter the free speech. That's what's important. And we'll come to that at the very end. We will not allow Russia to distort and rewrite history. And I think that's exactly where we should be. Okay, next big story. Negotiate with Moscow to end the Ukraine war and prevent nuclear devastation, says Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. Oh boy. So RFK and Donald Trump Jr. say that the U.S. should surrender Ukraine to avoid nuclear war. Well, that's convenient when you're surrendering somebody else's country, giving Russia a rhetorical victory after its failure to secure one on the battlefield. The defeatist stance disregards centuries of American courage and leadership in defending freedom. Like, conservatives particularly, where are you? You're supposed to be the ones defending this. This is like part of who you are. It's very frustrating. Ben Hodges says exactly right. RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. are incapable of understanding that the war is about far more than just Ukraine. It is about Ukraine, and what's happening to Ukraine is absolutely terrible, but it's about more than that. It's about defending the concepts of sovereignty, freedom of navigation, international law and agreements, isolating Iran, and deterring China. And we forget that to our detriment. Okay. Kyiv Post, Russia is reportedly transferring troops from the Pokrovsk direction and mobilizing fresh recruits for Kursk operations. Okay, don't get that excited. I read the article, and yes, that is true. Fresh recruits to Kursk, and they are moving some from Pokrovsk, but not a lot. The good news with Pokrovsk is that there has not been a lot of movement. 3 weeks ago, I was really alarmed that Pokrovsk, I was thinking Pokrovsk was going to fall by now based on what was going on just a month ago. And the momentum has slowed significantly in Pokrovsk. Okay, next story. Fateful elections. Can Moldova break free from the Kremlin's influence? Amid Russia's pressure on Moldova and Ukraine, Transnistria remains one of the key regions where the Kremlin is trying to maintain its influence. Now, it's fascinating that the Kremlin is in this country and that country and the other country and this country doing the same thing. They're the only ones like really mucking about in other people's countries in that neighborhood. Poland's not doing it. Estonia's not doing it. Germany's not doing it, but Russia is, and that's why everyone's worried about Russia. Next, I spoke to a Moldovan member of parliament, Nantoy. Nantoy calls Transnistria a blackmail tool that Moscow is using. The region has never been independent. Since its proclamation in 1990, it has been created to force Moldova to accept conditions favorable to the Kremlin. Transnistria is a region where the bandit regime controls the population by authoritarian methods and, thanks to corruption schemes, generously sponsors certain representatives of the Kremlin. Russia continues to keep military forces in the region despite international commitments to withdraw them, but you know how good they are with their international commitments. Russia has imposed a unique form of peacekeeping operation involving Moldova. The Kremlin supports a separatist regime not only with military force but also with free gas. However, the transit of Russian gas through Moldova, including Transnistria, is due to stop at the end of the year. The Kremlin is also actively using another region to destabilize Moldova. Nantoy is convinced that the Kremlin will try to weaken the position of President Sandu by supporting candidates who will act in Moscow's interest. The Kremlin is trying to realize the Georgian scenario. So they're in Georgia, well, they're in Ukraine, they're in Georgia, they're in Moldova, and they're also in Armenia. Armenia? Yeah, this just happened. Russia was preparing a coup in Armenia. Russia was preparing a coup in Armenia. Quote, the National Security Service managed to prevent a coup d'etat, the Investigative Committee of Armenia said in a statement. So let's look at this. This is in Politico. Moscow paid and traded a ring of insurgents in a bid to overthrow Armenia's pro-Western government. Relations between Armenia and its historic ally Russia have soured since Moscow invaded Ukraine in February 2022, with the South Caucasus country freezing its membership in the Moscow-led CSTO military alliance, dispatching humanitarian aid to Kyiv, and staging joint drills with U.S. forces. They want to be in the West. They want to be in the Western orbit. The president snubbed Putin about a year ago. It's really interesting to see what's happening there. Armenia's longtime rival, Azerbaijan, has forged closer relations with the Kremlin. Speaking earlier on Wednesday, they vowed that Armenia's pivot toward the West would continue, quote, if we see more or less realistic possibility of becoming full member of the European Union. We will not miss that moment. So that's what's happening. And much of this is a consequence of the war in Ukraine. And incidentally, they're trying to withdraw from the CSTO. And the CSTO is this organization that's kind of like NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's not really a real strong organization. Here are the countries that joined: Armenia, Belarus, and Russia, Tajikistan, right? And some were trying to get out, like Azerbaijan left, Georgia left, Uzbekistan left, and Armenia is trying to leave. So, yeah. All right. Now, let's look at the neighborhood. You know where Russia is, so you know where Ukraine is. Here is Moldova, and a good chunk of Moldova is occupied in Transnistria, and then you have Armenia down here. Armenia is sandwiched between Georgia, which also had its own problems with Russia, Georgia, Armenia, and then Iran. So that's the neighborhood. Wow. Okay. So this has nothing to do with Ukraine, but it's an interesting story and you should be aware of it. Israel simultaneously detonated thousands of pagers used by Lebanese Hezbollah members across Lebanon and Syria on September 17th. That's yesterday. The attack has likely had several negative effects on Hezbollah's military effectiveness, at least temporarily. The attack likely disrupted some internal communications across Hezbollah, especially given that the extent to which Hezbollah has been relying on pagers in recent months. The nature and scale of the attack also likely stoked confusion and shock among some Hezbollah members. The effects could drive general paranoia within Hezbollah as well, given that Israel has demonstrated repeatedly in recent months how deeply it has infiltrated Iranian and Iranian-backed networks. So what happened here was there was a shipment of pagers shipped to Hezbollah. The Israelis somehow intercepted it, filled many of them with explosives, and then waited for months and months and just detonated it yesterday. And because trying to stay off the radar, Hezbollah relies on these pagers, and it injured 300 or more of them. And then there were walkie-talkies. Walkie-talkies were booby-trapped in advance by Israel intelligence services and then delivered to Hezbollah as part of the militia's emergency communication system, which was supposed to be used during a war with Israel, the sources said. So they did it twice in a row. They're just messing with their heads. Doesn't relate to Ukraine directly, but just a story you want to be aware of what's going on in the world. Okay, last couple bits. Michael McFall says the right to self-defense is guaranteed in the UN Charter. If Putin doesn't want Ukraine to defend itself, he should not have invaded Ukraine. And we're talking about stuff like, well, this, right? If he didn't want that, I would love to know what Putin's reaction was. But if he didn't want that, he shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. And the Charter doesn't say you can only use your own weapons for self-defense. That's a great point. All right, I put 2 polls out yesterday, and I would like to talk about these very briefly. The Wall Street Journal suggests that 80,000 Ukrainians are dead and 400,000 wounded. This figure is, most of you, 40%, said accurate, and then about the same fraction, 20 and 16%, said it's too low or too high, which means that's probably about right. But what's interesting is the small percentage of killed as opposed to wounded on the Ukrainian side, as opposed to what we think we understand about the actual death to casualties on the Russian side. And then the second poll was this. I talked about banning RT from Meta, and that, it's more complicated than you think. It's not necessarily going to be a win. But most of you disagree with me, and that's okay. You're welcome to disagree with me. In fact, I applaud you for still listening to me in spite of disagreeing with me. That shows intellectual integrity on your part. So 66% of you said a 100% good thing, RT must be stopped at all costs. I disagree with that. I'm down here with it's mixed at 24%. I don't see 100% a bad thing, but it is mixed because it's going to cause that propaganda, instead of being able to deal with it in public, to go underground through tenant media, influencers, and that sort of thing. And even though 2 out of 3 of you disagree with me on that point, I appreciate that you're still willing to listen. Now, this last little bit that I want to leave you with is fascinating. Living up to the high journalistic standards, Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov identified the Israeli agent behind the latest Hezbollah pager explosion. His name is Mashkir Keshner. Okay, so they found the guy, right? This is followed by the previous identification of the agent behind Iran president's fatal crash, carried out, according to Solovyov, by Eli Kopter. Now, the fact that Mashgir Keshner is actually the Hebrew word for two-way radio and Eli Copter is a meme based on the word helicopter did not in any way impact Mr. Solovyov's reporting, who caters to an equally uninformed audience. Okay, my friends, thank you for listening to me even when you disagree, and I appreciate that you listen to me even though we don't agree. And I'm not the fountain of truth. Listen to other commentators and triangulate on what they say and make up your own mind. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.